Memories of Creature 88. Vincent leaned back in his chair, sighing out slowly as he felt the synth start to flow into his system. He shakily pulled the needle from his arm, setting it on the table next to his kit, before turning off the burner and untying the tubing he'd used to help find a vein. He might be addicted to the drug currently spreading throughout his body, but he didn't let it make him sloppy. The neon lights from outside his apartment seemed to grow more intense. He watching them flicker and flash through his apartment, enjoying the vibrant colors as they danced across the walls of his home. It was far better than the sounds these aliens called music. They all seemed wrong to him. Supposedly it had something to do with frequencies and shit he didn't understand. Overall, he seemed set for a nice, relaxed day. The synth was kicking in. He had some of that blue fruit juice stuff that would taste divine in a minute, and he'd set up a food delivery in an hour so he wouldn't have to try cooking while on synth. That had been a disaster last time. So instead he opened up the small wooden box next to his synth kit. Inside was a small glass sphere that glowed with some sort of golden light. It began to roll up his arm once he let it go, and he watched with a smile. He often wondered what it was. They'd given it to him that first week in the lab to calm him down, and it had worked. Once it had rolled up his arm to his shoulder, it crept along his back, and he giggled like a child for a moment. It tickled a bit, and felt warm, which he liked. After it had rolled past his neck, it began to move along the underside of his right arm. He lifted the arm up, watching the golden sphere climb up along it, defying gravity as it rolled up to his palm, and then up along the points of his fingers, before looping over and starting back down the top of his arm now. He had no idea how it worked or what it was. During some of his deepest synth trips, he figured they'd sucked his soul out and somehow encased it in glass. But that seemed unlikely. He'd just mess around with the sphere for the next few hours before going to sleep. There wasn't anything he needed to do anyway. Creature 88. He sighed out as he heard the voice and picked the sphere off his arm, pushing it back into the wood box, scraping it off his hand as he closed it to keep it inside. "Please call me Vincent," he said, and turned to the screen on the nearby wall of his apartment. "Regulations prohibit forming bonds with classified and unidentified species, let alone shades like you." Vincent rolled his eyes as he saw the angular face of his handler. The Yervesh were humanoids with bony faces and what looked to him like kabuki makeup. While they were similar to humans in shape and size, only they had quills instead of hair. Plus, would never be mistaken for a soft skin like him, instead covered in tough, flexible metal. They were the second most powerful of the species in the Union, second only to the dragons. He knew that wasn't their real name, but the first time he saw one, that's what they looked like to him. He wished he could tell them he was human, that he came from Earth, and try to explain how to find his home. But whenever he tried, something inside his head made him physically sick, and he couldn't do it, something those fucking worms had done to him in that lab. "I thought I was off rotation today." "You're never off rotation, Creature 88. He rubbed the tattoo on the inside of his left wrist. It looked to him like an 88, and when the Yervesh had found him in the lab, that's what they dubbed him. But he wasn't sure if they were speaking English, or he was thinking in some other language. His head was still all messed up from the lab. "We had an informant give us reliable information about a black blood den. Several felons are inside with heavy weapons. Hierarchy decided there is no value in arrests or captures in this matter. You're up." Vincent sighed softly. "Where is it?" "Subsector 54, Hab 3, Level 2, Rooms 63 through 66. The area is a slum. Hierarchy has authorized Class 3 weapons. Units are waiting to move in pending on your success or death." "You make me feel so valuable," Vincent muttered as he reached into his synth kit, pulling out a pink capsule which he tossed into his mouth and crunched down on hard. He felt the release of gas and chemicals as his senses cleared up, and he coughed for a moment before swallowing the capsule. The neon lights from the square were still flashing across his walls, but they were much less interesting and entertaining. "You're a pathetic shade soft skin who's addicted to synth. If you weren't as valuable to the hierarchy as you are, rest assured you would not receive the benefits you do." He hated being called a shade. It was some stupid Yervesh myth, or legend, or folklore, he wasn't sure, but he hated the story. "All right, Cav. All right. That's Special Operations Handler Cavazor to you, Creature 88. Do your job." The screen turned off as Vincent shook his head. He walked to his bedroom, the door sliding open before and sliding close behind him as he walked through. He then punched in his ID key into the terminal next to his closet, a door in the back sliding open to reveal his armory. The bright white light inside hurt his eyes, so he moved quickly. First, he pulled on his Special Operations vest and then the assault harness over it. He quickly holstered a Tybar cannon on his hip and then inspected his Yurvesh Special Operations Talon rifle. He missed guns. All these energy weapons packed a lot of punch, but the noises they made just weren't as impressive. Satisfied his rifle was in perfect shape, he stocked his assault harness with clip batteries and finally pulled his leather jacket on over the whole set. It was the one piece of clothing that was just like he remembered from before the lab. It was black leather, with a bright red and orange phoenix on the back of it, wings outstretched. Picking up his badge, he clipped it to his belt and then pulled on his mask. They'd made it special for his head since he could use other Yurvesh gear, but not their masks. When he looked at himself in a mirror, he looked like quite the figure. The glass eyes were blackened from the outside, but he could see through the computer-enhanced glass perfectly from his side. The angled mouth vent gave him a scowling look, and to be honest, he looked like a bad guy. But the badge on his belt made it clear he was on the side of the law. His short, shaggy brown hair sticking up over the top of his mask. His open jacket revealing the combat harness beneath clearly. They always told him regulations forbid unauthorized articles of clothing, especially over an assault harness, since it could impede effectiveness of the design. But that never stopped him. Once he was ready, he stepped back out of his armory, locking it behind him before walking to the door of his apartment. He took a moment and drew a deep breath before jumping up and down and shaking his arms and legs, trying to get the last of the sensations of synth out of his body. Finally, he opened the door and stepped out. The hall was quiet, but this was a nice hab on Subsector 5, so it was rarely busy. He walked down the hall to the quick lift and punched the down arrow. When the lift arrived, he heard the gasps of the civilians inside. Furry, scaly, slimy, never any skin like his. They were short, tall, fat, ugly, pretty, and in all shapes and sizes. Some with long ears, holes in their heads, no noses, too many noses, and every possible number of eyes. There were very few creatures in the Union he bothered to get to know. If they were too lazy to classify his species, why should he bother to learn most of theirs? He pressed the lowest button on the lift once he stepped inside and held his rifle with both hands, ignoring the murmurs around him. Through the descent, the civilians got off rather quickly, and when the others waiting on some levels saw him, no one else stepped aboard. Soon he was alone as the lift sped along down the levels of the city. Nothing connected from 5 to 54 directly. This lift only dared go as far as 30, the main level for the gray market. So when it stopped, he stepped off the lift. He heard it shut behind him quickly and rise up without waiting. He'd have to call it back down with his ID if he came back this way. Before him was a mass of creatures, stalls, stores, smells, sights, and sounds that would have overwhelmed him if had still been on the synth, but now just provided a minor distraction. He could hear more murmurs as he walked ahead, the crowds of aliens parting in front of him. They all knew what he was. At this point, the rumors had spread throughout the entire city. Creature 88, the Shade. He didn't mind. It made his job easier, and he didn't have to deal with shoving his way through the hordes of creatures here trying to buy and sell the things that weren't provided to them by the Union. The computer-enhanced glass in his mask was informing him of several illicit goods being bought and sold around him, but he walked past. The hierarchy didn't need him to police minor offenses. They had regular cops for that sort of thing, and even then they understood the purpose of the gray market. They just wanted to stop the black market, and black blood was about as bad as it got. The substance was 5 times more addictive than synth, and the chances of ODing on it were 10 times worse. That didn't stop the hordes in the slums from buying it up wholesale and begging for more. He wasn't quite sure what it did since it apparently wouldn't work well with his body chemistry, but nothing he'd seen about it looked good. Once he'd crossed the market, the sea of creatures having closed behind him, he found a dirty lift that would go as far down as he needed. Once inside, he pushed the button for subsector 54, and then locked the doors to ensure a speedy trip. Outside, things were getting darker and darker the deeper he went, as soon the fog clouded up the lift's window and he couldn't see anything outside. Subsector 54 was about as bad as he expected. Burnt-out speeders, scorch marks on the walls from weapons fire, bars on the few windows he saw, and the fog keeping visibility quite low, or at least low for people who didn't have high-tech masks on. He found the building soon enough, but didn't see the Yervesh teams waiting nearby. Probably stealthed until he dealt with the heavy hitters. The Hab building was more secure than the others around it, but his security code worked on the entry door without issue. He stepped over a passed-out creature just inside the doorway, black gunk dripping from his mouth, or whatever that orifice was. He found the stairs and climbed them to the second level, following the signs on the walls to the rooms he wanted. He hadn't seen a single lookout or guard. Either these felons were sloppy, stupid, or simply figured no one would bother them. He stood in front of the door and pulled a small inhaler from a pocket on his harness, pressing it to the mouth vent of his mask. He activated it and sucked in a deep breath of cold, minty gas that burned his lungs a little. He could feel his blood pumping faster as his adrenaline levels began to spike. Pulling a small device the size of a deck of cards from his harness, he slapped it to the door and quickly pressed the button in the middle. He had 5 seconds to step back and pull up his rifle before the device blew the door into tiny pieces. He jumped through the smoke it had created, swinging his rifle up as he pressed it to his shoulder. Inside were mostly the flabby bulk of Roviks, 4-legged, 4-armed creatures with reptilian scales but faces like rhinos. They were all significantly larger and stronger than Vincent, but they were also surprised. He could see the dirty room had been converted to a lab of sorts, with bubbling chemicals and burners on tables around the felons. If he wanted to keep from exploding, he needed to watch his fire. Pulling the trigger of his rifle, he sent out a burst of green energy orbs into the first Rovik, dropping the fat creature immediately as he quickly switched targets. They were slow to react, and he dropped 4 before the 5th was pulling out a Tybar cannon like the one on his hip, but a burst of energy dropped him like the rest. It almost seemed too easy with the adrenaline pumping through his body. Vincent scanned the room and wondered if this could really be that easy. His handler had made it sound like this was a tough job. He began to advance past the tables of bubbling chemicals to the next room. He pressed his shoulder to the wall next to the door and plucked a small disc from his harness. Pressing a button on the disc, he tossed it inside and heard the screams of Roviks as he rounded the corner. 3 Roviks in the next room were all clutching their ears, having dropped several more Tybar weapons as the sound debilitated them. Good thing for him, his shitty ears couldn't pick up the frequency. He held the trigger down as he sprayed the 3 of them with those green energy orbs. They twisted and shook as their bodies were slammed into the wall behind them before they slowly slumped to the ground dead. They'd been standing behind a table covered in credits and vials of black blood, but he ignored it and moved on. The last room had a sealed security door, and he pulled another doorbuster from his harness, slapping it into place. But before he could activate it, the door slid open, and a Servian slasher lunged forward. They reminded him of those insects back on Earth that looked like sticks. They seemed way too tall and skinny to stand up under their own weight, with a hard exoskeleton and long blade-like arms. They were notoriously fast, and Vincent would have to agree with that sentiment as he felt the creature's arm pierce his chest, driving through his torso as he immediately coughed up blood. He was impaled heavily on the creature's arm as it hissed down at him with obvious delight. Vincent dropped his rifle and clutched the creature's arm as he began to drag it back away from the security door it had jumped out of. It hissed in surprise now, as he refused to die so easily, red blood flowing quickly out of the wound as he felt his life draining away. That hardly mattered, though. The creature struggled, but Vincent was stronger as he backed up, 1 step at a time until he had drawn it into the first room full of chemicals. He could tell how terrified it was, wondering why he wouldn't just die, why he was doing this. But Vincent didn't speak. He just coughed up more blood and dragged it to the ground, hands squeezing the arm, impaling his chest to make sure it couldn't escape. Finally, he'd lost too much blood and everything went black. Detecting his death, his special operations vest underneath the combat harness activated the dead man's switch and detonated the explosives that lined his vest. The hab shook as the black blood lab exploded. Vincent opened his eyes and stepped out of the pod, completely naked. There was a whole row of pods, all with other copies of him floating inside. Down at the far end in a massive tank was his original. Just like always, he waved at it, and then looked forward as he began to pull on the clothes that had been laid out for him. "What happened this time, Cav?" He heard the Yervesh growl out as it stepped into the room. "Why must you insist on calling me that creature 88? Why do you insist on calling me creature 88? He was pulling the boxer briefs they provided on at the moment. "You unnerve me. You're a shade. I wish the hierarchy would just drop this ship into a star." Ah, yes. Shades. The mythical, legendary folktale monsters that would rise again and again, living in the shadows, killing innocent Yuresh and feasting on their souls so they may live forever. "I'm not a shade. I'm a clone," he said as he pulled his shirt on over his head. Those fucking worms had abducted him, tortured him in the lab, fucked up his brain doing whatever the hell it was they were doing, and stuffed his real body in that big tank at the end. Then the Yervesh had raided their ship, killing the worms, and found him. Or the first clone, at any rate. They didn't understand what the worms had been doing any more than he did. He wasn't even sure how long he'd been on the ship. His memories of the lab were twisted and painful whenever he tried to focus on them. What he did know was that apparently no species had a concept of cloning. Memories, brains, personality that couldn't be copied over. It worked with humans for some strange reason. Well, he had the same memories up to a point. He knew today was supposed to be quiet. Just hang out in his apartment and trip on synth. So what killed him? Did he jump out a window again? "You were sent to clear a black blood den. You died and blew everything up." Well, that does sound like me. Survivors? There is a sealed security door. The team on the scene is waiting for your arrival. They see no reason to risk their lives going in first. Wonderful. Did they collect my black box? The memories he had since his last update were kept on a small device that was embedded in the skull of every clone. It was more of the worm's doing. The Yervesh understood what it did, but not how it did it. The entire ship was being examined and disassembled aside from this bay that contained and created more clones for them to toss into danger. The hierarchy was most interested in the strange technology present on the worm ship, but since no creature could be cloned except humans, and he couldn't tell them where he came from, they left it intact. He was their pet project for now. So long as they fed him and gave him a job, he'd do it. Everyone on the Union had to pull their weight after all. "Yes, they collected your black box. Hurry up and get dressed. We'll send you down on a flyer so you can open that door and see what's behind it." "Should I get my combat harness?" he asked as he pulled on another copy of his black leather jacket. He'd made it clear they could give him whatever clothes they wanted, so long as they always included one fresh copy of his jacket each time. "No, the other teams are in place. You don't need weapons." He shrugged and followed the Yervesh. As always, he wondered what the point of all this was. What had the worms wanted him for? He wished the Yervesh hadn't killed them all, but apparently the worms always fought to the death anyway. He didn't really understand the politics of the Union much. They'd put him to work right away, insisting the cost of his rescue needed to be repaid. So they'd towed the ship to their capital planet and loosed him upon their criminals. At least he got a nice apartment out of it, plus all the synth he needed once he discovered what the drug did for him. Cav escorted him through the halls of the ship. He hated the sterile white tubes and was very glad the pods weren't stored in the same lab they'd experimented on him in. The path to the nearest airlock was fairly straightforward, and he was soon outside. The wind here was brisk since they were so high up off the surface of the planet. The city was all around them, but here he got a chance to look up into the sky. There was so much light from the city he couldn't see any stars, but he knew they were up there. Cav waved him forward to the flyer on the landing pad before them, and he nodded, jogging over to climb into the vehicle. Flyers looked to him like helicopters that were missing their blades. Instead, they moved around with adjustable engines attached to the nose and tail. They weren't jets or props, but some sort of gravity manipulators, he'd been told. Still all over his head. He was the only person in the open bay as it took off, quickly dipping over the side of the landing pad and diving straight down into the city below. He disobeyed safety regulations by standing in the open doorway as he watched the buildings and concourses flash by, trusting the gravity well to keep him from flying out to his death. If he did, they'd just have to fly back up to the ship and wait for his next clone to get in. But he didn't have to, as the flyer soon leveled out and began to fly straight, just above the fog bank. Once it was in the right area, it dipped down and landing on a pad connected to Subsector 54. There was a team of Yurvesh in their yellow and black combat armor waiting to escort him. Without his mask, he could barely see through the fog, so he had to follow them into the structure that made up the subsector. Once inside, he saw a real shithole of a subsector. Their burnt-out speeders, scorch marks from energy weapons, and bars on the few windows he saw. He wondered if his previous clone had noticed the same things. Was he walking the same path the other version of himself had taken? The building that had a fire suppression vehicle hovering in front of it was clearly their destination. He followed the team inside and saw the remains of a lab, and his own scattered remains plastered around the burnt room. "Where is it?" he asked the closest senior team leader, who pointed to a bag they'd set on one of the few remaining tables. Walking over to it, he upended the bag, as his burnt, scorched head dropped onto the table. His features were mostly burnt off, but it wasn't like there were other humans around here, so he figured it was his own. Picking it up, he rolled it over and pulled a knife free from his belt, jamming it into the flesh at the base of his skull. He grimaced a bit as he had to cut through some muscle and sinew, but then he felt the resistance of the box and pried it out with a fleshy pop. Behind him, he heard a Yurvesh remove his helmet so he could puke, leaving grayish-blue splatters on the ground. Must be a rookie. He turned the small black box over in his hand for a moment, wiping the remains of his blood and flesh from it before tucking it into his pocket. He'd upload it when he got back to the apartment. The rookie was still leaning over, trying to keep from heaving again when Vincent picked up his charred, burnt head and pressed it to the side of his current one. "What do you think? See the family resemblance?" A few chunks of his past body dripped out of what remained of the neck, and the rookie quickly hurled once more. "You're disgusting shade." The senior team leader muttered as Vincent laughed and tossed his head to the Yurvesh, who had to drop his rifle to catch it. "Seal it up in a biohazard containment unit. The hierarchy doesn't want my biomass to go to waste. They prefer recycling my remains or experimenting on them." He walked past and into the second room. It had been partially destroyed in the explosion, but he could see some scattered credits and vials of black blood. The security door still had a doorbuster on it, where he presumably had placed it last time. He was about to activate it, when instead, he just pushed the button on the side of the door and it slid open. Inside was a surprisingly clean room. There was a terminal hooked up to a strange device he didn't recognize, and tables covered in enough weapons to supply a small army. But as he walked through the room, he saw a table at the end that just held a small wooden box. Wood was exceptionally rare on this planet. Ignoring the weapons, he walked up to the box and opened it up. Inside was a human hand clutching a vial of red blood. Next to it was a small black box. He blinked as he stared into the box. That wasn't his hand, seeing as the skin was black. It was a human hand. Human. He picked up the black box and turned it over in his hand as he heard the senior team leader. "Is the room clear?" A million questions were racing through his mind, and he looked over his shoulder before blinking and coming to his senses. He stuffed the black box into his pocket with the other one and closed the box. "Yes, the room is clear."